In the early years of the Vietnam War, American F-4 Phantom pilots flew the most powerful fighter jet in the sky and struggled to win dogfights against North Vietnamese aircraft that were, on paper, far less capable. The Phantom was faster. It could climb higher. Its radar and missiles were, in theory, more sophisticated than anything the North Vietnamese Air Force possessed. And yet, in close-range combat, American kill ratios against Vietnamese MiG fighters dropped alarmingly low, a fraction of what they had been in Korea, less than 2 decades earlier, when American pilots flew far less advanced aircraft. The problem wasn't the Phantom's engines, or its speed, or its radar. The problem was that American doctrine had bet everything on missiles, and forgotten, almost entirely, how to fight a gun-to-gun dogfight in the confusing, close-range chaos of real aerial combat. What followed was one of the most remarkable turnarounds in the history of American air power, a story of an aircraft nearly failed by doctrine, and then completely reborn by it. This is the story of the F-4 Phantom.
Another world, sky.
The F-4 Phantom was designed in the late 1950s for a very different kind of war than the one it would eventually fight. McDonnell Aircraft developed the Phantom originally as a fleet defense interceptor for the U.S. Navy, an aircraft built to detect incoming Soviet bombers at long range and destroy them with guided missiles before they ever got close to an American carrier group. That mission shaped nearly every major design decision. The Phantom was built enormous by fighter standards, powerful, fast, capable of carrying a heavy load of long-range radar-guided missiles. Its 2-man crew, a pilot and a dedicated radar intercept officer, reflected the complexity of managing sophisticated radar and missile systems in an era when computing power still required significant manual operation. And critically, the Phantom's designers made a decision that reflected the prevailing military doctrine of the era. The aircraft would carry no internal cannon. The thinking, widespread across American military aviation planning in the 1950s and early 1960s, held that the era of the close-range dogfight was ending. Guided missiles, it was believed, would allow fighters to destroy enemy aircraft from miles away, long before a traditional gun battle could ever develop. A cannon, in this view, was obsolete weight that could be better spent on missiles and fuel. The Phantom entered service with the Navy in 1961, and the Air Force soon followed, adopting the aircraft despite its Navy origins because of its sheer capability. It set numerous speed and altitude records in its early years, cementing its reputation as the most advanced fighter in the American arsenal. Then came Vietnam, and a very different kind of war than anyone had planned for. Vietnam exposed the flaw in the doctrine almost immediately. Combat over North Vietnam rarely resembled the long-range missile engagements American planners had envisioned. Rules of engagement often required visual identification of enemy aircraft before firing, a requirement driven by the need to avoid friendly fire in crowded, confusing airspace, but one that eliminated much of the range advantage American missiles were supposed to provide. Once visual range was reached, combat frequently devolved into exactly the kind of close, twisting, turning dogfight that missile-focused doctrine had assumed would no longer happen. And in that environment, the Phantom's missiles repeatedly underperformed. Early Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles had reliability rates far below what planners expected. Some estimates suggest well under half of all missiles fired in the early years of the war either failed to launch, failed to guide correctly, or failed to detonate on contact. American pilots found themselves in close-range combat against smaller, more maneuverable MiG-17S and MiG-21S, armed with an aircraft that had no cannon at all, no backup weapon for exactly the situation the Phantom kept finding itself in. Kill ratios against North Vietnamese fighters, which had been overwhelmingly in America's favor during the Korean War, dropped to levels that alarmed military planners. By some measurements, the ratio fell to nearly even a deeply troubling result for the world's most sophisticated air force, flying against a smaller, less advanced opponent. The Navy and Air Force each launched investigations into what was going wrong. The conclusion, when it came, was uncomfortable but clear. American pilots had lost the fundamental skills of dogfighting because doctrine had told them, for over a decade, that those skills would no longer be necessary. Before we continue, let's take a closer look at the aircraft at the center of this story. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, one of the most produced and most widely used fighter jets in Western aviation history. Role: originally a fleet defense interceptor for the Navy, it became one of the most versatile combat aircraft of the 20th century. Fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance platform, all in one airframe. Wingspan: 38 feet, 5 inches. Length: 63 feet. A large, powerful twin-engine fighter, unusual for its era in carrying a two-man crew, pilot and weapons systems officer. Engines: 2 General Electric J79 turbojets, capable of pushing the aircraft to Mach 2.23, more than twice the speed of sound. Original armament: exclusively missiles, a mix of radar-guided Sparrows and heat-seeking Sidewinders. No internal cannon in early versions, a design decision that would prove costly in combat. Later versions added an internal M61 Vulcan cannon, correcting one of the aircraft's most significant early shortcomings. Over 5,000 F-4 Phantoms were built between 1958 and 1981, flown by the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, and by the air forces of more than a dozen other nations. Now, let's get back to our story. In 1969, the U.S. Navy responded with one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American air combat training. They established the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in California, an elite training program designed to do exactly what the previous decade of doctrine had neglected: teach fighter pilots how to win close-range dogfights, using real adversary aircraft flown by instructors trained specifically in the tactics of Soviet-designed fighters. The program would later become famous under its unofficial nickname, Top Gun. The results were dramatic and measurable. Navy pilots who went through the program returned to Vietnam with a fundamentally different set of skills: an understanding of energy management in a dogfight, of how to exploit an opponent's weaknesses, of when to fight and when to disengage. Navy kill ratios against North Vietnamese MiGs improved substantially in the years following the program's establishment. The Air Force, observing the Navy's results, developed its own version of realistic combat training, eventually evolving into the red flag exercises still conducted today. Alongside the training revolution, the aircraft itself was corrected. Later F-4 variants added an internal M61 Vulcan cannon, the very weapon system doctrine had once declared obsolete, finally giving Phantom pilots a reliable backup for exactly the close-range situations Vietnam had proven were far from a thing of the past. The combination of better training and improved weapons transformed the Phantom's combat record. Pilots like Navy Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham and his radar intercept officer, Willie Driscoll, became the first American aces of the Vietnam War, credited with 5 aerial victories. Air Force pilots like Captain Steve Ritchie achieved similar distinction, becoming the Air Force's only pilot ace of the entire conflict. The Phantom that had struggled so badly in the war's early years became, by its final years over Vietnam, one of the most effective fighter aircraft in the American arsenal. Not because the airframe itself had fundamentally changed, but because the people flying it and the weapons systems supporting them finally matched the demands of real combat. By the time production ended in 1981, more than 5,000 F-4 Phantoms had been built, making it one of the most widely produced Western fighter jets of the entire Cold War era. Beyond American service, the Phantom was exported to more than a dozen Allied air forces around the world, including Israel, where it flew extensively in Middle East conflicts, including the 1973 Yom Kippur War, as well as the United Kingdom, West Germany, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, Greece, and Iran. The United States retired its last active-duty F-4s from combat roles by the mid-1990s, though modified versions continued flying as unmanned aerial targets, used to test newer weapons systems, well into the 2010s. Remarkably, decades after American forces retired the aircraft from frontline service, a small number of nations continue operating F-4 Phantoms today, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the original design. Even as the aircraft has been continuously modernized with updated avionics, radar, and weapon systems far beyond what its 1950s designers could have imagined. The Phantom's real legacy, though, extends beyond the airframe itself. The lesson learned from its early struggles in Vietnam, that technology alone cannot substitute for trained skill, and that even the most sophisticated weapons systems must be matched by realistic, rigorous training, reshaped American military aviation doctrine permanently. The Top Gun program, born from the Phantom's early failures, became the model for advanced combat training used by air forces around the world, its influence extending far beyond the aircraft that made it necessary in the first place. The F-4 Phantom entered Vietnam as the most advanced fighter jet in the American arsenal, and nearly stumbled because the doctrine behind it had forgotten a fundamental truth about air combat: that no missile, however sophisticated, could fully replace a pilot's skill in a fight that didn't go according to plan. What followed was not a story of aircraft failure, but of institutional learning under the harshest possible conditions. The Navy and Air Force studied what had gone wrong, rebuilt their training from the ground up, corrected the aircraft's most glaring weakness, and turned the Phantom into one of the most effective fighters of the entire Cold War era. More than 5,000 were built. More than a dozen nations flew it, and the lessons learned from its rocky start over North Vietnam still shape how fighter pilots are trained today, more than half a century later. Few aircraft in history have been so nearly failed by doctrine, and so completely redeemed by the willingness to admit the doctrine was wrong. If you'd like to support this project, the link is in the description below. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We'll see you on the next flight.